Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
Glen Mulcahy was the former head of innovation with RTE, but now having founded his own media training and consultancy firm, he is also the man behind the annual MojoFest event, which takes place next month. Glen, before we discuss this year's MojoFest, provide us with an insight into your previous role with RTE.
Well, when I was recruited effectively as the head of innovation, my main job was to look at kind of business opportunities and potentially business threats outside the scope of traditional television. So the role looked at things like drone cinematography. Obviously, mobile content creation was a big part of that. We also looked at virtual reality and 360 video. So consumer trends that might have presented new ways of telling stories for RTE, but at the same time things that might shift our audience base in years to come.
So what was your approach to that particular role?
It was very much a case of experimenting firsthand to be able to make an informed decision on what the potential, I guess, for a lot of the new technology trends were. So there was a kind of a research/innovation part to that. Partnerships with external companies as well was a kind of a fundamental part of it. So I would have networked a lot with both app developers, hardware developers, and some universities as well in relation to research that they were doing. And ultimately, it was to feed all that information back into the organization. So both briefings to the executive and also to other members of staff.
Sounds like an exciting role. So why in 2017 did you decide to depart that role and start Titanium Media?
That's a really good question. A couple of different reasons. One of them was that I had been living in Dublin at that stage for about 8 years, and I was conscious of the fact that we had a family of 2 children at that stage and another one on the way, and it was partly a kind of a quality of life decision. I wanted to buy a house somewhere in the country. I did that daily commute every day for about a year and a half and realized that even though on paper it was supposed to be an hour and a half each way, in practice, often days it could be double that. So RTE announced a redundancy scheme, and I'd been with RTE, including my time at TG Carr in the early days, for a total of nearly 20 years. And I just decided it was time to flee the nest, so to speak. I guess also over the last 5 years, as I developed a mobile kind of journalism program, which I initially started to implement within RTE, I started to get requests to go to other broadcasters around Europe and further afield to do training for them. And that market gradually started to grow, with the result that eventually I think people in RTE were probably starting to look at what I was doing and saying, how often is he here anymore? So in some ways it kind of suited everyone, I think, for me to jump ship and basically to go full-time into training. And I have to be honest, a year and a half into it, I have no regrets. I thoroughly enjoyed my time in RTE, but I'm very much enjoying the challenges of basically meeting new clients all over the world and spreading the good news of what you can do with smartphones.
Now, the reason I've asked you to join us on this morning's show is to discuss MojoFest. It's a conference that's taking place in Galway from the 6th to the 8th of June 2019. But start by providing us with an insight into what MojoFest is all about.
Well, MojoFest, it started, believe it or not, back in 2015 when I was with RTE. I pitched the idea that we should host a conference all about the potential of smartphones for both the media industry and beyond. It took a while to convince them to let me do it because it's not part of their traditional kind of, product of things that they do. But in the end, basically, they said, okay, let's go for it and let's see how it goes down. And the very first one was really, really well received for a first attempt. We had about 350 delegates, and they came from 27 countries. So that was pretty good for a first go. Now, 5 years into it, after leaving RTE, we mutually agreed that I would basically continue the idea, but under a new brand, a brand that I own, I guess. And the idea is to expand it even further. So it's now no longer just focused, if you like, on journalism and media. Now very much we look at the opportunities for marketing, and we look at the core skills of photography and filmmaking. We're very much interested in drone cinematography and also virtual reality. These have been strands that we've explored in previous events.
And what is the format of this year's festival?
Every day we have a mixture of plenaries and workshops. So typically between 9 and 1 we'll have 3 panels and a keynote. And then in the afternoon, there's usually somewhere between 12 and 14 1.5-hour workshops. Some of the workshops can span the entire afternoon as well. And the whole idea is the morning sessions, it's to try and give you inspiration based on the real world stories, if you like, of people who are up on stage sharing what they've achieved and the lessons they've learned along the way. And then in the afternoon, a lot of those same speakers host actual hands-on workshops where you can actually learn the practical skills of how to do what they did. So from that point of view, it's very much a mixture of kind of inspiration and practical practical skills. Each day follows that format, but each day also has its own specific kind of focus. So day one is very much focused on VR, on filmmaking, and on photography. Day two, the focus changes, and it's very much on kind of marketing and opportunities for SMEs. And then day three is where we go back to its original focus and look at journalism and all aspects, basically, of the media.
And you've just revealed 2 out of the 3 keynote speakers at the festival.
Well, I'm really delighted that the first keynote speaker that we announced is a woman called Dima Khatib, who basically is the managing director of AJ Plus. AJ Plus is a digital startup that started within Al Jazeera out in Qatar about 4.5 years ago. And it's quite an interesting backstory because Al Jazeera, initially when they set up in 1996, they recruited an awful lot of ex-BBC staff to start the organization. But they subsequently realized that, the demographic or the audience that they had was very much starting to shift towards the 45-plus age group, as many broadcasters are experiencing now. So they decided to look at how could they reach a younger audience and what was the best way to basically, connect with them. So AJ Plus was started as a mobile-first, digital-first newsroom, not worried about television sort of protocols or production or anything like that. Very much start with a blank page. How would you speak to this audience? So the first thing they did is they recruited a very young workforce. I think the average age there is about 26. And the second thing they did is they experimented an awful lot with developing stories that work very, very well on social media and particularly very well on mobile. So Dima has been at the helm as the managing director of AJ Plus for a couple of years at this stage, and I was lucky enough to bump into her in Doha when I was out there recently enough actually doing training for Al Jazeera. And I mentioned about the conference and basically what the objectives of the conference are, and she was really, really interested to kind of tap into that community and share their story. So she's keynote number 1 that we've announced. And then the second keynote, who's a similar-ish name but not in any way related, is a woman called Wad Al-Khatib, who basically has just won Best Documentary at South by Southwest in the last 2 weeks. She basically is a Syrian native who lived in Aleppo and who chose to stay within Aleppo for nearly 5 years during the war. And she is a classic case of where mobile, I guess, really gives a voice to people who otherwise have no voice. So she was a citizen journalist. She lived within Aleppo when it was under siege. And her reports, her stories, as she filmed them and documented them every day, ended up basically being shown on Channel 4 and achieved somewhere over 80 million views. So
wow.
She's going to share her story of what life was like on the ground and how mobile helps to basically tell the world about what was really going on the ground inside Aleppo.
Now, I know that when this conference started out, Glenn, it was aimed at mobile journalists, but it has really broadened out since then, hasn't it?
It has, very much so. So, like I say, a lot of the other trends that I suppose are within the radar of, members of the public and I guess also enterprise. So the third speaker, I'll give you an exclusive on this one. His name is Philip Bloom. Philip basically is ex-Sky, but over the last 10 years, he's been one of the real pioneers in using, DSLRs and large frame cameras and things like that to shoot beautiful cinematography. Now, he, of late, in the last 2 to 3 years, has really started to experiment with 360 video and virtual reality. And he's going to both host a keynote session about the power and potential of that for business, and then an actual hands-on practical workshop on how you can basically use some of these now very, very cost-efficient consumer cameras for marketing. And obviously one of the big potentials of this is for people who work in the real estate market or, who sell houses basically, to be able to do virtual tours of properties, but on a fraction of the budget of what it would have cost to create those virtual tours just a couple of years back.
I'm sure that particular talk will be of great benefit and interest to our listeners this morning. Now, last year, the cinema world was rocked with the launch of Steven Soderbergh's Unsane, because it was the first feature-length film shot on a smartphone by an A-listed Hollywood director. But in your opinion, are we going to see much more of this in the years to come?
Well, it's a really interesting question. Soderbergh has actually kind of rocked the boat a second time. In the last month or so, he actually released an entire TV series on Netflix that also was entirely shot on an iPhone. But I guess the big question that people ask is, does it mean that basically Hollywood in its entirety will migrate to smartphones for production? In short, the answer from my perspective would be no. It would kind of basically be like asking someone who traditionally drives a massive articulated truck if they would prefer to drive a van to move all the goods. Yes, you'll ultimately get there, but the journey and the experience of doing it will be very, very different. So where smartphones really have untapped potential, I guess, is creating relatively quick decay content on social media, stuff that shouldn't cost an arm and a leg to make because ultimately within 15 minutes it's effectively no longer valid. and also for news, where obviously everyone is basically biting into the news, on a as-you-go basis through social media on Twitter and Facebook and so on. Feature film stuff, when you look at the practicalities of it, they still basically follow a lot of the big norms. Like there's an entire sound production crew, there's a grip crew, the post-production process still needs 20 or 30 people. It's I think in the case of the stuff that Soderbergh has done, and the other cases that have been shot in features, because it's not the first one ever done it, but it is exactly what you say, the first time an A-lister has done one. I think it's partly for the PR, to be perfectly honest.
And I suppose while everyone with a smartphone can now shoot content and upload or stream it online, the quality of production is still a major issue when it comes to sound quality, staging and lighting.
Yeah, so again, it really depends, I suppose, on the scale of the production that you're going to do. I mean, audio, I think, certainly has improved substantially over the last 3 to 4 years in the sense that we've seen brands, professional broadcast brands like Sennheiser, Shure, Rode, all these brands bring out specific bespoke microphone solutions for smartphones. So to a certain extent, those boxes have been ticked somewhat. But at the same time, we're still just limited to 2 tracks of audio. So, for high-end production, you might want an awful lot more. And equally, exactly as you say, even though you can live stream, single or multi-camera, the reality is that what you put in front of the camera is actually probably more important than the actual camera itself. So, I mean, the talent and the set and the lighting and all that stuff is the stuff that really gives your production that kind of, high production value. And often, that's where you'll end up spending the money. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a misnomer to think that everything can be done on the cheap and it can be all done in shortcuts. I mean, it is, at the end of the day, a phone, but also just another camera. And the production values still need to be basically upheld because that's ultimately what your brand is. That's what the audience will assess.
Now, we're hearing lots of talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning. How impactful will they be in relation to smartphone content creation, in your opinion?
Well, I think they're going to affect pretty much every facet of our life, to be honest. In some ways, actually, I think they probably are, to a very, very subtle extent, already having a fairly dramatic impact. But I just think that it's so subtle that people don't even realize it. So there's been a lot of experiments, obviously, in the last 12 to 18 months in relation to how artificial intelligence and virtual reality assistants can assist us with our daily routines. I often find in my workshops, I ask people, do they use Siri or Cortana or Alexa? And I've noticed a substantive trend in the growth, in particular, of Alexa use over the last 12 months. So at the end of the day, these voice assistants are effectively live microphones in your home that are capturing every single word that you utter and waiting for you to basically issue a command that they can respond to. I think in due course, we'll probably start to look at the idea of where does that information reside? Who owns that information? Because certainly from our perspective, we have Alexa in our living room, but I keep it on mute most of the time unless we have a specific use for it. I think given everything that's happened with Facebook and the whole, the privacy issues that have risen in the last 12 to 18 months, I think we're probably going to see more of a regulatory spotlight on this idea of our right to privacy and also our right to ownership of the data that's been harvested. So certainly a trend to keep an eye on. Flip side of that, though, is, there's definite benefits as well. If you look at what Tesla has achieved with automatic driving, I know there's been a couple of incidences of road accidents, but certainly statistically speaking, it's safer for a self-driving car to drive you than it is for you to just take the wheel yourself, certainly in the test in the States anyway. And I think that technology in the medium to long term is definitely going to be advantageous to us. But as with all things, I think the regulatory framework needs to catch up with the pace of evolution and innovation in this technology because right now it's pretty much running completely unfettered.
The term live streaming has come up more than once during this interview, but what, in your opinion, does the future hold for this?
Well, live streaming is a really interesting one. I mean, technically live streaming has been around for over 15 years. The very, very first live streaming stuff was all webcam based on your laptops. But I think social live streaming, when Periscope and then when Facebook Live launched, it kind of upped the game completely. I would still say that the biggest challenge for them, to be perfectly honest, is proper discovery and valuable content. I mean, just because you can go live doesn't really mean that you should. And I think that's where they're attempting to make a play for more professional content and trying to encourage kind of pro producers to stream on their platforms. Again, that's a little bit of a double-edged sword because, as you kind of highlighted earlier on, you can go live with 4 phones. We've done it at the conference in the past. We've had 8 hours of live streaming chat shows basically run from the event just using 4 phones and an iPad. But we do go to lengths to try and make sure that it's lit properly and that the sound is professional quality. And this year we'll probably even go a little bit further and try and make sure that the set looks as good as it possibly can as well. I still think it's probably an under-tapped opportunity for, say, local radio or for local newspapers, because traditionally you serve a very, very finely defined market and audience, and they have a huge amount of trust in your brand. And, flip side of that is, could you diversify what you do that allows you to do a live talk show via Facebook, say, once a week using phones from the crew that you have? I would say yes, and I think there's a real opportunity for radio stations and, like I say, local newspapers to explore that space.
Many organisations and brands are left in a bit of a quandary when it comes to sharing stories on social media. The question that always gets asked time and time again is, should we shoot vertical, landscape, or natively in the format of the platform we will share on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get asked that on every single workshop that I do, Karl, to be honest with you. My short answer, and it's to be perfectly honest, is it really, really depends. Do you need to create content that is going to be shared on multiple different platforms? And if so, is the prospect of shoot once and share everywhere your preferred option? If it is, there is a way of doing that as long as you have a premium smartphone. And believe it or not, this philosophy has been adopted by RTE. It's one of the small legacies I'd like to claim anyway. So a lot of the higher-end smartphones in the market now can shoot what's called 4K or ultra-high-definition resolution. It's 4 times bigger than the broadcast signal that you get to your TV. If you shoot in 4K res on your high-end smartphone, then you can bring that footage into an app like Adobe Rush or LumaFusion if you're on an iOS device, and you can basically crop it down to a widescreen or a vertical video version for whatever platform you're sharing it on. And one of the speakers again this year is going to be one of the guys that leads that project, Philip Bromwell, where basically RT has been doing exactly that. They shoot stories, social-driven stories, that may very well go out on the 6-1 News in 16:9. They'll certainly go on the RT website in 16:9, but they are also published in a specially edited vertical version, but they still only shoot once. They shoot at 4K, and they basically edit it in 3 or 4 different versions for all the different platforms. So, again, if you're a small to medium-sized business and you're kind of thinking, mother of God, that sounds fierce complicated, then if you're only publishing your content on Snapchat or on Instagram, then by all means, shoot it vertical natively. But if you want to be able to share it broader than that, then the shoot once and basically shoot in extremely high quality so you can edit it down is a really, really sensible workflow.
And what other tips can you share this morning with novice smartphone content creators?
I guess at the end of the day, there's a few things. A lot of the kind of community that I would move within get very, very excited about gadgets and gear. But at the end of the day, no matter how much money you spend on gadgets and gear, if the story that you're telling is not good, then, the best gear in the world is not going to make it a great visual story. So I guess the key skill is really being able to identify really, really good visual stories that the audience is going to care about. And once you manage to perfect that skill, then you don't need to spend a fortune on basically kitting yourself up with loads of gear. It's a simple accessories like a tripod, a microphone, maybe a simple little light, and a battery pack is pretty much all you need to add onto your smartphone. Obviously, the only other addition is the right apps. So very much that's the beating heart of MojoFest. It's that idea of trying to show people the basics and bring them along on that journey of turning them into really, really good visual storytellers.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Glen Mulcahy from MojoFest, and it certainly sounds like this event should be attended by anybody who wants to be at the forefront of smartphone content creation. We're almost at closing time here now at Business Matters, but before we go, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my production team, my guests for their contribution, and especially you as always for listening. Join me again next Saturday morning when we'll have more from the world of business, but until then, have a profitable week.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
South